Again, the overall topic will be the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, the aftermath, and burial. Now, before we understand why there was an assassination, we've got to set the stage for a presidential assassination. What was Kennedy doing in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963? Why was he there? You know, what was the whole situation that led to him being in Dallas? Well, that's what I'm going to tell you with the first subtopic, which is setting the stage for a presidential assassination. Now, this is November of 1963. So what's going to happen, Ryland Mako, of importance in 1 year, in November of 64? Presidential election. And President Kennedy is planning on running for re-election, but he is not confident that he is going to win. And he believes in his mind that if he does not win the state of Texas and their 25 electoral votes, he may not win the presidency. So with the upcoming presidential election of 1964, Kennedy was considering a trip to the state of Texas because he wanted to go there and mend political fences in the state of Texas, because he knew to win the election of 1964, he would need to win the state of Texas. Now, Naya, when I say mend political fences, what do you think I mean?
Like, he did something
that might hurt his chances of winning that state? That's pretty close. He didn't, but something was going on. Why do you mend a fence? Because it's open and it's letting your livestock out, which hurts your business, right? So he's going to mend these political fences. Something's going on in Texas within the Democratic Party that's going to hurt his chances to be reelected. That fence is open, and he's going to go there to mend political fences, to get that fence put back up so that his cattle or his livestock or his Democratic colleagues in that state are on the same page. Because if they're not on the same page, that benefits the Republican candidate. So you're all confused now and you're saying, what in the world are you talking about, Mr. Durr? Well, the two most powerful Texas politicians were fighting among themselves. And Kennedy had to get that fixed. Now, what separates your own political party and beliefs? Whether you are what or what? What? Well, let's not get that crazy yet. That's a little bit more of an extreme than I want, but you're close. We have that split exactly in our country right now between Republicans and Democrats. Democrats are considered liberal and Republicans are considered conservative, which is kind of interesting compared to these days. But the point is, you had the two most important politicians in Texas that were fighting among themselves because one was conservative and one was liberal. Who was the conservative politician? Texas Governor John Connally. Here's a very good, we'll start getting into the wall now. Here's a very good picture, if you look over here please, of John Connally right up there. It says, why Kennedy went to Texas. That's what we're talking about right now. Cover of Life magazine. John Connally, the governor of Texas, favored the conservative wing of the Democratic Party. And he was bickering with Senator Ralph Yarborough, who supported the liberal wing of the Democratic Party. Here's a picture, although smaller, but right here of Ralph Yarborough. So the reason Kennedy's going to Texas is to mend political fences. He's got a crack in the armor. He's got a crack or a division in the Democratic Party. Governor John B. Connally of Texas is feuding with Republican Senator Ralph Yarborough of Texas. And Kennedy sees that as a no-win situation for the party in the upcoming election. Now somebody else is going to chip in. This is kind of what happens in high school drama. Two people aren't getting along and then somebody comes in and supports one of the two and they pick on the other. Who do you think is the most powerful Texan, although he's not serving in Texas at the time, that's going to jump into the equation and pick a side? Should be easy. Should be easy. Lyndon Johnson. Vice President Lyndon Johnson decides to side with Governor Connolly because he's a good friend of Connolly's and they're both conservative Democrats. So Vice President Lyndon Johnson gets in the dispute and he supports John Connolly against Ralph Yarborough. And Yarborough's feeling a little picked on, Aaron Vigil, because what's coming up in '64 besides a presidential election? Governor, Congress, senators and congressmen, right? President, vice president. And what's Ralph Yarborough's paranoia? That Johnson and Connolly are going to do to him concerning this upcoming election in '64. What's he going to do, Aaron? What are they going to do? What's his paranoia? They're picking on him. They don't like him. That's right, by finding a conservative Democrat to run against him in the primaries. So you've got a heck of a mess down there. Connolly is feuding with Yarborough. Johnson's jumping in the fray supporting Connolly. Yarborough's paranoid. He is certain that those two men are going to try to find a conservative Democrat to run against him in the election, in the primaries, and get him out of office. Why else might Johnson support Connolly if you take into consideration the Democratic National Convention of 1960, Leighton? Why would Johnson not like Yarborough?
Are they running against each other?
No. But think about it. What might Yarborough do to Johnson in the Democratic National Convention of 1960 that would make him mad? Anybody? Not vote for Johnson, but vote for Democratic National Convention when they're choosing a presidential candidate. Does Yarborough support his fellow Texan, Lyndon Johnson, for president? He gives his delegate votes to who? Kennedy. Ooh. So Johnson didn't like Yarborough anyway because he saw him as a disloyal Texan. When you were at the Democratic National Convention in 1960 and they were doing the roll call vote and they got to Texas, you gave your delegate votes to John Kennedy, not your state man, so to speak. So it wasn't hard for Lyndon Johnson to do that. Now, if you look at this in perspective, President Kennedy knows that this dispute has to be halted in order for the Democratic Party to win Texas and those 25 electoral votes needed in '64. So, in early November, he and his aides are planning a 2-day trip to Texas. November 21st, 1963, and November 22nd of 1963. And the purpose is political. That's not the reason they're going to give for him going there, but it's definitely the reason. So, on November 21st, Press Secretary Pierre Salinger announces to the public that Kennedy will make a 2-day trip to Texas on the 21st and 22nd, although this had been in the plans for several weeks. But it wasn't announced publicly to the main American population until the 21st. Okay? Now, here's how this is going to work. The reason they give for Kennedy going to Texas was to inspect military installations. Okay, they don't say it's political, but if you could read between the lines at all, they know he's going there for political reasons. But the official reason for going to Texas was to inspect military installations, which he will do, partially. Okay? Now, he's going to visit 5 different cities is what he's going to visit in Texas. He's going to visit first San Antonio and Houston on the 21st. San Antonio and Houston on the 21st. And here's what's going to happen. He's going to inspect a military operation in San Antonio, and he's going to give a speech at an Air Force base there. And how it works, kiddos, picture in your mind, is the airplane lands at the airport, they get into a limousine, and they have a motorcade to the place he's going to speak. So in the motorcade, generally you have a lead car, the presidential limousine, and then a Secret Service car, and then any other dignitaries that might be there, including the press. And they basically go from the airport when it lands, through whatever town they're going in an open limousine, it was not uncommon, to the place he was going to give a speech. So he lands in San Antonio, they do a motorcade, he gives a speech. They go back to the airport, the same day they fly into Houston. Have a motorcade, going through the town, he gives his speech. The speech he gave in Houston was a fundraiser for the Democratic Party where he spoke in behalf of Albert Thomas, who was also running for Congress in the upcoming election of '64. Okay? Albert Thomas. Now, if I give you these names and they're not on your ID sheet, you know what that means? I'm having a hard time sticking to the condensed version. And so if I mention the name and it's not on the ID sheet, you can just kind of listen. Does that make sense? Well, the next day, he's then going, well actually to be honest with you, he flies into Fort Worth, Texas on the 21st, late. And on the 22nd, he's going to give a speech in Fort Worth. And then he's going to go to Dallas, and I'll give you that exact agenda in a minute. Okay? So, the 21st, what does the president do? He flies into San Antonio, takes the motorcade, gives a speech at an Air Force base, gets on the plane, flies to Houston, gets in a motorcade, gives a speech in honor of Albert Thomas, who's running for Congress, gets on the airplane, flies into into Fort Worth late, and goes to bed. Okay, that's the 21st. That's behind us. In the detailed version, I would have told you everything he did in his speeches and the whole thing, but we'll go from there. So, let's talk about the 22nd. What's he going to do the 22nd? Before I tell you, you all know that President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, right?
Yeah.
During this discussion in early November, when they thought they might go to Texas, all of his aides tried to encourage him not to go to Dallas because people were so outspoken against his policies there. Southern radicals. They had assaulted Adlai Stevenson just a few weeks before when he gave a speech at the UN where he finally had to stop his speech and say, do I have to come all the way to Texas to teach Texas manners? They were horrible to him. And they could see that they could embarrass the president. They weren't really thinking he could be killed. They were thinking somebody might hit him over the head with a sign like they did to Adlai Stevenson, or chant during his speech like they did with Adlai Stevenson, or just be rude. And so they said, you know, the people of Dallas are kind of out there, so let's skip Dallas, okay? The president listened to him very intently, but he simply agreed to disagree, and he had the last word, and said, I'm not going to go to Texas and try to mend political fences without going to the city's second largest city of Dallas. Just not going to happen. So, they planned this 2-day trip, San Antonio, Houston, Fort Worth, Dallas, Austin. Okay, now we'll tell you the agenda in just a second. Now, let's talk about a couple other things when we get into why he would go to Dallas and go to Texas. His approval rating from the time he was elected to this time in history of November 22nd, 1963, had dropped from 76% to 59%. It's a pretty good drop. So his popularity rating had dropped from 76% to 59%. What was the sole reason for that drop? What did he support that caused that drop in civil rights? Very good. So President Kennedy's approval rating had dropped from 76% to 59%, mainly because of his support of civil rights and the South's frustration with that, especially Texas. And he knew it was going to be a close race. Who did he think could possibly beat him for the presidency in '64 if he didn't get Texas? What's that? No, he wasn't. He's worried about the other part. Who's going to run for the Republicans he'd be afraid of? Say it. That's that's awesome. Okay? His first concern is Nelson Rockefeller. He thinks Rockefeller will maybe get the Republican nomination. He believes Rockefeller might have enough to beat him. Who else was he afraid of? His son ran for president in a couple of election or so ago, Mitt Romney. He was afraid of Michigan Senator George Romney, who he believed had the moxie to beat even 64 if he didn't get Texas lined up. So my point on telling you these two things about Rockefeller and Romney is he wasn't going to go to Texas without going to Dallas. He just didn't think that was wise politically. Okay? And he believed that he must have a good appearance in Texas to win the upcoming election of 64, and if he didn't show in Dallas, that was not going to work for him. Now, who does he take with him as his biggest asset? Mrs. Kennedy. And she hadn't traveled with him since the loss of her child, when Patrick died. She had not traveled with him since then. When's the last time she traveled with him, if you were listening to the videos? When he went to France and then met with Khrushchev in Austria. Last time, and then the baby Patrick died, and she had not traveled with him since. But she decided to go on the Texas tour with him. And he was thrilled about it because she could draw a crowd. Okay? Now, I told you what happened on Thursday, November 21st. The president left Washington, D.C., flew to San Antonio, then to Houston. He rode in motorcades and gave speeches in both those cities. And after a speech in Houston, he flew to Fort Worth on that day, where they stayed for the evening. Now, here is his agenda. This is important you know this. This was his agenda. This is what was supposed to happen on Friday, November 22nd, 1963. This is what was supposed to happen. Some of it did, most of it did not. At 9 o'clock in the morning, he was scheduled to give a breakfast speech at the Hotel Texas for the Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce. So his first order of business on the 22nd of November 1963 was at 9 o'clock he was going to give a breakfast speech for the Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce at the Hotel Texas. Kind of interesting sideline to this, you don't have to write it down. About 2,500 people, 2,500 people had gotten tickets for that speech. Many, many could not. And so he impromptu gave a speech in the parking lot of the Hotel Texas to those people that could not get tickets. So he came down on his own. It was very, very brief. But he gave a speech and then went in to give his speech at the Chamber of Commerce. After his speech in Fort Worth, he was going to make a short flight to Dallas, Texas, landing at Love Field. After his speech at the Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce, he was then going to board Air Force One and take a short flight to Dallas, landing at Love Field. Once he landed at Love Field, the presidential limousine had been flown in, and he would ride in an 11-mile motorcade all the way through downtown Texas. From Love Field all the way through downtown Texas. Eventually ending up at the Trade Mart, where he was going to address 2,500 luncheon guests. So he was going to land in Love Field, get in the presidential limousine. His motorcade would take him through an 11-mile trip through downtown Dallas, where he would end up at the Trade Mart, where he would give a luncheon speech to about 2,500 guests. The Trade Mart, kiddos, would be kind of like the Casper Event Center, or the Rimrock Auto, the old Metro in Billings. That's what I've been there. It's a big convention center, is what it is. Changed quite a bit since then, but it's still there. And he was going to address 2,500 guests. Obviously, he didn't get there. He was assassinated before he got to the Trade Mart. But this is what his day was supposed to be. After his speech at the Trade Mart, he was going to fly to Austin, Texas, where he was scheduled to speak at a $100 a plate dinner, which would be about $800 a plate today. So after his luncheon speech at the Trade Mart in Dallas, he was going to fly to Austin, Texas, where he was scheduled to give a speech at about $100 a plate dinner, which would be about $800 today. When he got done with that speech in Austin, he was going to take a helicopter flight to Stonewall, Texas, and spend the night at Vice President Johnson's ranch. So the schedule for President Kennedy on November 22nd, 1963, 9 o'clock in the morning, breakfast speech at the Hotel Texas in Fort Worth for the Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce. A very short flight to Dallas, landing at Love Field, where he would get in the presidential motorcade and take an 11-mile trip through downtown Dallas, eventually ending up at the Trade Mart, where he would give a speech in front of 2,500 guests. He would then fly to Austin, Texas, where he was going to speak at a $100 a plate dinner. He would then depart Austin and take a helicopter flight to Stonewall, Texas, and spend the night at Vice President Johnson's ranch. That was the agenda. Obviously, it did not get filled. So that'll take us to our next subtopic, which is pre-assassination order of events. Exactly what happened time-wise prior to the assassination. The pre-assassination order of events. We're talking about Fort Worth. In Fort Worth at Carswell Air Force Base at 11:20 a.m., Air Force One took off heading for Dallas. At 11:20 a.m., after the President's speech in Fort Worth, Air Force One left Carswell Air Force Base heading to Dallas. Now these times, just so you know, are Central Standard Time, Texas time. So at 11:20 a.m., Air Force One departs from Carswell Air Force Base in